Alright, so for this next part, what I want to do is take the code that we had worked on for the image demo, where we were displaying two images in our application. I want to go ahead and modify that to actually make use out of this setup for button behavior that we showed in the previous video. I want to use that so that we can actually set it up in such a way that we can go ahead and change the image from one to another. So we're going to display a single image in the application and then just have a button that allows us to kind of swap back and forth between the two. More specifically, what I want to try to do for this one is actually set it up so that we have two separate buttons, one to be able to switch to the second image, and then another button so that we can switch back to the first image. Okay, so I've got the code for the image demo opened up already. And what I want to go ahead and do is just make a new project or new file, and then just move all of this code into that one. Since the majority of it's going to stay fairly similar, or in some cases exactly the same, I just need to make a few modifications and then start adding the additional code to this so we can start introducing the behavior for those buttons. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new file for this. And for this particular one, the primary thing that I'm going to be demonstrating here is going to be the setImage method. So I'm going to call this the setImage demo. So setImageDemo.java. I'll come over here and just grab all of this code. Just copy that and paste that right there. So the very first thing I want to do is make sure that my class name matches the name of my file. So I'm going to change that to setImageDemo. Save that. And then from here, I'm going to go ahead and start modifying a couple of things. But before I get into too much of the modifications for this, I want to go ahead and go through the design of this to make sure that we fully understand exactly what it is that I'm going to be doing as far as the interface, the layout goes. So I'm going to come over here, and first we're just going to go ahead and make a little construction of what I want this interface to look like. So we can kind of imagine that this is going to be the application window for this. And so then I'm going to have my image right here in this in the middle of it. In this particular case, we can assume that this is going to be just the first image. The second image will not be displayed when we first open the application. So when the window first is being displayed, only the first image is being shown. And then underneath it, I want to go ahead and make two buttons. So we're going to have one button right here, and then one button right here. And these two buttons are going to be used to change between the two images. And the way that I'm going to do this is that essentially this button is going to be the next button, since it will just navigate to the next image. And this button is going to be the previous image, used to navigate to the previous image. Okay. So looking at this, the overall structure for this, we're going to have the image up top and then two buttons underneath. So we know because we have this sort of top-down approach right here, this is going to be a vertical arrangement, meaning we need to put all of the content into a VBox. And then the two buttons themselves, they're going to be side by side like this. So that tells me that I need to put these into an HBox. So in addition to showing the structure like this, I also want to go ahead and try to make a scene graph so we can actually see what this looks like as far as the hierarchy of these containers and controls goes. So the first thing I'm going to need at the very top of this is going to be my root node. So see if we can position this about right here. And for this root node, this is going to be the VBox that contains everything. Let's set that to something more like 24. Should be large enough. And then connected to this VBox, we have two different things. So the first one is going to be the image. That's going to be at the top of this. So we'll go ahead and put the image right here. And the control that's going to end up going here is going to be the image view. I'll represent this as just IV. So that'll end up being the variable name for this image view. Place that there. And then the next thing I'm going to need is going to be the HBox that contains the two buttons. So we'll position that right here. So this will be my HBox. And then the HBox itself is actually going to be a branch node. So the VBox is our root node. This is the very top of the hierarchy or the structure for this application. This IV is a leaf node for the image view, since that's just to control the very end of everything. But the HBox itself is going to be a branch node, since this is something that is connected to the root node, but then has additional nodes connected to it. So we need to connect some additional nodes here, and those additional nodes are going to be the two buttons. So for this one, we'll have something like a previous button, and we'll also have something like the next button. Okay, so this gives us a general idea about precisely how this layout is going to look, and also helps us show the hierarchy of all the different structures that we're going to be including. So this shows us our VBox container, our image view, our HBox container, and then these two button controls, our previous button and next button, and how these are going to be connected to one another, or how they relate to one another. Okay, so now that we've seen all this, we can come back over to our code and start adding a couple of things to this. So first we'll start with the imports. We'll take a look at what we have right now and see what we need to add. So we've already got a VBox. We just need to go ahead and add an HBox as well. We've also already got our image and image view. We just need to include a button. Oops. Okay, so that covers everything that we're going to add to this. We've still got our two images, so we'll go ahead and leave those alone for right now. I still want to be able to load both of these images. The only thing that really needs to change as far as this goes is that I no longer need a second image view, since I'm only going to use one for this particular application. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the second one. And then I'll also go ahead and change this to just be IV, since it's the only image view I'm going to be using now. I can also go ahead and modify a couple of other things related to these image views. So I'm going to go ahead and change this preserve ratio. I only need to set that for this one image view I have. I don't need this second one anymore. Additionally, I only need to set the width for one image view and go ahead and get rid of the other one. And then one additional thing I'm going to change here, this is going to become more apparent once we actually get into the application, once we've seen it. I'm going to go ahead and change this so that instead of doing set fit width, I'm going to do set fit height and change this from 300 to 400. And the main reason that I'm going to be doing that is because of the fact that if we look at the application itself, you'll notice that the image is going to be just above the two buttons. If I am trying to set this in such a way that the width is constant, but the height will always change depending on what the aspect ratio of the image is, then it's going to essentially move these two buttons up and down to match the height of the image. And I'd prefer to try to keep these buttons in a constant position in the application window. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of invert this so that now the height is constant and the width will automatically be adjusted to preserve the aspect ratio. And as far as the height goes, this is just a height that seems to fit best with these two images. So 400 is what I'm going to go with for this. Okay. The next thing I'm going to go ahead and do, I'll leave the spacing for this alone. I'm going to go ahead and remove the rest of this. So we just need the single image view that I've got. We'll still set the alignment. We'll leave the dimensions for our scene the same. They'll be 1000 by 1000. And then this is going to be the setImage demo. Okay. All right. One additional thing I'm going to do as far as my text editor goes, I'm just going to go ahead and set this to have word wrap. That way then this URL doesn't go off the page anymore. Okay. So we'll go ahead and run it like this just to be able to see what this looks like with just that single image view being placed in the center of the application. So I'm going to go ahead and compile this. And then we'll run it. Okay, so now we can see we have our single image just right there in the very middle of the application window. And now we just want to go ahead and start adding the two buttons underneath it. So we'll go ahead and close that. and then coming back over here. So in addition to the image view, I want to introduce two buttons. So I'll go ahead and place those within the same little portion of my code. So the first one I'm going to need is going to be the previous button. So we'll have our prev button. This is going to be equal to a new button. And for the text on this, I'm just going to say previous image. So this is essentially a button that's used to navigate back to the previous image. And then I'll have a second button. I'll call this a next button. This is equal to a new button. And this will be for my next image. And essentially this one is going to be used to navigate to the next image. Okay. Once I've got these two buttons, I then want to go ahead and put these into an H box. So we'll go ahead and do that right here. So we'll have our H box. This will be a new H box. For the two buttons, I'll give them 10 pixels of spacing between them. And then we'll put in our previous button first, and then our next button. Okay. And then finally, I want to go ahead and take this H box and add this to my V box. We can see that again back in the scene graph. We see that this H box contains our two buttons, and it's part of our V box. So I'm going to go ahead and put the H box. This will be underneath the image view, that IV object that we created. So go ahead and take a look at this interface now, compile that, run it. Okay, and so we see our two images, and then one last thing I want to go ahead and do is to fix the alignment on our H box. So I want to go ahead and do hbox.setAlignment, do pause.center again. And then we'll go ahead and do one last check just to be sure that everything is as we expect it to be. Perfect. All right, so now we've got our image, we've got our two buttons. Now the next thing we need to do is to actually give them some behavior. As you can see, when I click them, nothing happens yet. So we need to go ahead and start creating our event handler so that we can capture the event that's being fired whenever we click one of those buttons. Okay. So we'll do this in the form of a private inner class. So we're going to do private class. In this case, we can call this something like, we'll call this image action for now, since this is an action that's related to changing our images. Again, we're going to need to make sure that this implements the event handler interface, and this is going to be using action events. Okay, and before I proceed any further with this code, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that we've actually imported these two things. So coming up here, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I import these two classes from that event package. So I'll have our javafx.event.eventHandler, and we'll have our javafx.event.actionEvent. Okay. All right, so now that we've got all that, now we can continue with this. So we've set up our image action. This is going to implement our event handler. We'll go ahead and implement the handle method. So we'll do public void handle. We'll put in our action event. And then we'll start adding in some code for this. So the question now is, what exactly should the code for this look like so that we can actually capture the behavior that I've been talking about so far? So the behavior that we're expecting is that whenever we click one of these buttons, we want to change the image in some way. And the way that I want to approach this is that I want to be able to use this image action to be able to handle the behavior for either one of these two buttons. So essentially what that means is that depending on which button I click, the behavior for this particular method should be different in some way. So essentially what that means is that somehow I need to be able to determine if the next button is clicked, then I want to move to the next image. Whereas if the previous button is clicked, then we should move to the previous image. So the question now is, how exactly do I actually achieve this kind of behavior? So for the first part, we're going to take a look at these two if statements I'm trying to use. So we're saying something like if next button or if previous button is clicked. So how do we determine which button has actually been clicked? Well, I mentioned before that whenever we perform some kind of action, so say like a mouse click, that an event is being generated from this. In addition to the event being generated, the source of that event, meaning the button that you clicked, is also recognized in the program. So the way that I can do this is I can say if event.getSource. So I can use this getSource method to be able to check to see the source of a particular event, meaning I can check to see what button was clicked to cause that event to be created or constructed. And then what I can do is I can go ahead and check to see if the source of that event happens to match with a particular button, then that tells me which button was clicked. So the thing that's being generated or the thing that's being returned when I do getSource is essentially going to be the object that generated that event, meaning that it's going to be the button object that was clicked. So what I can do is I can actually do a comparison of that against each of these buttons. So this is not going to use the equals method. Instead, this is going to use the equals operator. So we're going to use this because the thing that I want to compare is actually going to be the reference to this object, because I want to see if the source of this event is actually the exact same object that I have up here. So we're going to say something like event.getSource. If this is equal to, say, the next button, then that tells me that I want to go ahead and move to the next image. So we'll have our two if statements first. So we've got if event.getSource is equal to the next button, then we'll go ahead and move to the next image. And if event.getSource is equal to the previous button, then of course we want to move to the previous image. So now the question is, how do I achieve the desired behavior when one of these conditions is actually met? Well, in order to do that, I need to use another method that's available through my ImageView class. And that's going to be the setImage method. So the way this is going to work is I'll get my ImageView and I'll say setImage, and then I'll pass into this the image that I want to set this image view to. So in a similar way as when we did our constructor for the image view, we specified which image we wanted to use. We can go ahead and do the same thing here and just change it to something else. So in this case, now I'm going to set the image to image 2, since that's the next image that I want to use. And then for my previous button, this is going to navigate to the previous image, which is to say image 1. So when this button is clicked, we're going to set the image to image 1. Okay. All right, and then one last thing I need to go ahead and do, well, two things actually. So the first is going to be that I need to move a couple of these things into the global scope, since I'm using them within this, this handle method. So we can see that we're using next button, previous button, the two images, and the image view. So I need to go ahead and move these 5 things into my class level or global scope. So I'll save that, move these here. Go ahead and adjust the spacing on each of these. And then also go ahead and set each of these private to keep this application as secure as possible. All right, so we've got our 2 images, our image view, and our 2 buttons all moved to that global scope. We've still got all of our code in our start method to kind of set up and customize these. And then we've also got this code in our handle method to be able to handle any event that occurs whenever one of those buttons is clicked. Now the only thing I need to do is make sure that this, this event handler has actually been registered to those buttons. So coming up here, in addition to this code for my image view, just underneath that, we'll go ahead and introduce some code to register these events to these buttons. So we'll use that setOnAction method. And we'll make a new image action. And then we'll have our next button. We'll set this one. And again, give it a new image action. Okay, so these are both going to use the exact same class. So they're going to have objects of that same class, image action. And then because of this getSource method, that's how we're going to determine which one of these 2 buttons is actually clicked. So we can decide which piece of this code we want to try to execute. Okay, I'll save this like this. come over here, we'll compile this, see if I made any mistakes. Looks good. We'll go ahead and run this. Okay, so we've got our image displaying, we've got our two buttons. So if we click the next image, it will move to the next image, so it changes to image 2. If I click next image again, then nothing will happen since it's already on image 2. Whereas if I click the previous image, this will navigate back to the first one. And if I click previous image again, we'll see that nothing happens since we're already on image 1. Alright, so at this point now we've completed everything that I wanted to do for this application. So this shows kind of the step-by-step process of going through the design phase, showing the interface, the hierarchy for our scene graph, then proceeding to implement that, run it through a couple of tests as we move through each stage of it until eventually we finally get a fully functioning application and get to see our end result right here. And the next couple of videos, what I want to take a look at is I'm going to take the same application that we just finished, and I want to come up with a couple of different ways that we could implement the event handler. So in addition to doing it as a private inner class, the other two ways that I want to talk about a little bit, just as kind of a brief introduction to these two concepts, we're also going to take a look at creating an event handler as an anonymous inner class, as well as a lambda expression.